Hello, welcome back to the latest dose of science news from New Scientist. I'm Penny Sarchet and I'm joined by Timothy Revel. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Penny. Pleased to be back, even though it is a bit of a bummer week in some ways.
Well, yes, but this is also a week where we're uncovering the origins of writing. We're looking at bats on a treadmill. We're checking in with the world's largest tree. And we're following up on global climate negotiations.
Yes, they roll on. Science rolls on, and there is plenty to talk about, that is for sure. So how about we begin this week with that first story that you mentioned, a finding that is rewriting our understanding of the origins of writing.
Yeah, that's right. So this discovery concerns cuneiform, which you may or may not know is the world's oldest writing system. For decades, researchers have been trying to work out how cuneiform began. And now new clues are giving us a picture of how the invention of writing was a sort of decentralized process, one that wasn't issued from the top of some big hierarchy, but one that actually many people across a wide area probably contributed to. So to tell us more about that really interesting discovery, we're joined by science journalist Michael Marshall, who wrote about this story for us this week. So first off, could you just give us a quick primer on cuneiform? What is it? Where was it used? When was it invented?
Sure. So cuneiform is the oldest known true writing system in the world. It's invented with some error bars around 3200 BC in Mesopotamia. So we're thinking sort of present day Iraq, that kind of neighborhood. It's a writing system that was used, well, initially to write Sumerian, and then later on it was adapted to write a bunch of other languages, including like Akkadian and Babylonian. At the very earliest bit of it, we're not quite sure what language was being spoken, but Sumerian seems like probably a good guess. It looks like, so it's written on sort of slabs of clay, and it's all these sort of little wedge shapes, it's kind of like little triangles with curved edges of varying levels of complexity. And it was probably the most famous thing that was written in cuneiform is the Epic of Gilgamesh, this sort of classic epic tale of like ancient heroes. But that's actually about 1,000 years after the invention of cuneiform. So we're going well back even before Gilgamesh.
Wow. I was actually at the British Museum last weekend and I saw some. It's kind of amazing, isn't it? And it also has been studied for decades, well, since the 19th century, really. There's been a huge amount of attention and archaeological study on this writing system. So what is it that we still don't actually know about it?
So, I mean, it has been deciphered. We understand what like most of the symbols mean, but most of the cuneiform documents haven't been translated because there are like hundreds of thousands of these clay tablets that have been recovered. And translation is never like a trivial thing. It's it's sort of time consuming and complicated. So actually in recent years, people have started using AI, like machine learning, to try to speed up this process of translating all these things and working out exactly what they said. But the big thing that we're sort of thinking about this week is, where did cuneiform come from? How did this, fully functioning, very elaborate writing system originate? What were the steps that people took to get there? So we already knew that before cuneiform, there was this simpler system, which is called proto-cuneiform. And that was being used 150, 200 years earlier, something like that, within a few centuries of it. But we knew less about where that then came from.
Yeah, so you say we did know less about where it came from. I feel like you're teeing us up here. But what actually is proto-cuneiform, and what are we learning about it?
So proto-cuneiform isn't quite writing. It's proto-writing. So it's something that is almost but not quite what we would think of as true writing. And the thing that sort of distinguishes it from true writing is that it doesn't have as many grammatical rules. So you can't convey quite such complex and subtle meanings. Well, you can use it for labeling. So you could, in proto-cuneiform, you could say 7 bushels of wheat. This container has 7 bushels of wheat. But what you couldn't do would be to say, next Friday, I will deliver you 7 bushels of wheat after lunch. Because it just wasn't up to that level of complexity. You couldn't sort of describe the relations between the concepts in that way. But it does, superficially, it looks a certain amount like cuneiform. Like, a lot of the shapes of the symbols are kind of similar. And there's also some conceptual things that carry over. So, for instance, counting in base 60. It seems to be a commonality across both of them.
Okay, well, what do we know about its origins? Do we know how proto-cuneiform came to be?
So there is a long-standing idea about this, which is that clay tokens were the key. So tokens were these sort of little clay objects that would come in a variety of shapes, or like maybe like a cylinder or a sphere, and they would have often like patterns engraved into them. And so what you could do is you could press those into wet clay to leave a symbol or a mark in it. So a bit like a signet ring, that a medieval king would wear, and he would sort of push it into some hot wax to sort of leave his mark and say, this is my official letter. People were using these tokens in a sort of similar official way. And what's been known since the early 1990s really is that some of the symbols that you see on the tokens are similar or virtually identical to the symbols that we see in proto-cuneiform. So the idea was that people sort of invented the symbols and used them on the tokens, and then that got carried over into this more elaborate thing that we came to call proto-cuneiform. But there's a but. There's a lot of symbols in proto-cuneiform, and you can't find all of them in the tokens. You can't trace all of them back to the tokens. So that doesn't mean the tokens are nothing to do with it, but it perhaps means that they're not the whole explanation. So the new finding this week is that a team of archaeologists has found evidence that another kind of object with symbols on it also contributed to proto-cuneiform. And these other objects are things called cylinder seals. So it's kind of a similar idea, but they're cylindrical objects, and they have patterns and images like embossed or engraved all the way around the big surface of the cylinder. So again, you would press it into wet clay, but you would roll it across the wet clay so that the images from every side of the cylinder would get pressed into the clay. And those are found in a wide area, Mesopotamia, but Southwest Asia in general, between around 4,400 and 3,400 BC. So the period that's sort of leading up to proto-cuneiform and cuneiform.
So is that a sort of technical finding where we're learning that they use different implements, or does that kind of push our understanding on in general of how this writing system came to be?
I think it pushes on or pushes towards a different understanding of the kind of social system that was operating, and the circuit and like the social mechanisms through which proto-writing was invented. So what we can see from the cylinder seals is that they were involved in what I guess you could call bureaucracy or commerce. So often they were being used to sort of mark like the transport of goods. We've delivered you the 7 bushels of wheat, or some of them have like lists of cities. So they kind of seem to be records of, for want of a better word, diplomacy or like alliances or interactions between different societies. So they're being used for these kind of sort of almost bureaucratic, governmental, and economic things, but they're spread over a very, very wide area. So this is the period in time when there are starting to be what we would think of as cities and states. So the sort of big one is this Uruk in Mesopotamia. But these things aren't sort of confined to Uruk. The tokens and the cylinder seals are being found over a really, really wide area. The idea that has been around in the literature is that writing was sort of something that was invented by like bureaucratic elites, the most powerful people, as they were sort of bringing society under control. So, the invention happens, we sort of imagine, in Uruk, in and around the palace or whatever. But actually, because these symbols and these tokens and objects and cylinder seals are being found so widely, that kind of suggests that actually it's a little bit more decentralized than that, and that actually people from all around this area are sort of contributing into the development of proto-cuneiform. It's not to say that the elite at Uruk didn't have a significant role to play. It seems likely that they did, because that's what elites do in societies. But I don't think that they had like 100% control over what this writing system became, because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to get everyone to use it. I think the suggestion is that there was a degree of give and take, and that there were lots of the little less powerful people in villages or tradespeople moving around the place, and they also had some input into what became proto-cuneiform.
I think it's really interesting that these trade networks that were over quite a wide area really seems to have driven this writing system, whereas perhaps from a position of relative ignorance, I might have thought that the first writing was used for like religious texts or recording history or telling stories. Is that what we'd expect? I mean, this is basically what we sort of decry now as potentially red tape. Is that what we would expect to be the first type of writing?
Red clay tape.
Red clay, yes.
I mean, it does seem to be a fairly universal observation. So there's only a handful of instances where people have independently invented writing. So Mesopotamia is the oldest one. There's also Egypt, hieroglyphics, China and Mesoamerica. And then there's some ongoing arguments about the Incan Empire and the people of Easter Island. But you can still count these on the fingers, really. And in all the ones that are sort of well established, so Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica, the first writing is being used for, admin, essentially. And it's a kind of, but it's a response to the way that societies are changing and to the rise of, obviously farming. People had started sort of settling down into farming communities several thousand years before. You're starting to get larger and larger cities with more elaborate, with more top-down state control. And that necessarily means that you need to sort of be keeping track of everything. Who's actually living in your city, who's gone, how much, do you have enough food for the coming dry season or whatever. So it's kind of a response to the need to take greater control of society and of the world around you. On the other hand, there is an on the other hand to this, which is that if you go back into prehistory, before the advent of farming and complex states, people were making symbols on cave walls for thousands of years. And then that sort of there's like a set of symbols that you can find in caves on multiple continents. And nobody knows what those symbols meant. We sort of tend to think of cave art as having like a ritualistic or religious aspect to it. So maybe if that stuff is a precursor to writing, then maybe the function of writing has changed over the millennia. But since nobody knows what those symbols meant, I think that's a bit of a mystery. But certainly the first true formalized writing systems, it's mostly bean counting.
That's great, Mike. Thank you. And I should add, Mike writes a brilliant newsletter for us, Our Human Story, all about this sort of revolution in archaeology and the story of humanity. You can find that on our website, newscientist.com.
Just last week, we were hearing on the pod about a big COP summit in Colombia, and now another one is about to start in Azerbaijan. It's really a COP bonanza, and our environment reporter, Maddie Cuff, is here to explain what's the point of it all and how the US election could affect it. Maddie, let's start with this COP double bill. What's actually going on?
Hey guys, so yes, you're right, we did just have a COP. A COP stands for a Conference of the Parties, and the COP that we just had took place in Colombia, and that was a whole meeting about saving nature held under the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity.
Yeah, so we had James Deneen on the podcast last week, and he was kind of telling us how it was going on, but it hadn't yet concluded. How did it end? Did it end well?
Oh, not sure I have great news on that front. There was one significant breakthrough, which was that countries agreed to establish a global levy on the revenues of products that are made using genetic data from nature. So that's mainly pharmaceutical products, to be honest. And that could potentially generate billions of dollars for conservation efforts. But the big but is that contributing to this fund is voluntary for companies. So we'll see if it makes a difference or not, whether companies feel under enough pressure to donate. On the other side, though, the rest of the meeting was pretty chaotic, to be honest. Countries didn't make nearly enough progress on other biodiversity goals that they have agreed, and the talks ended in disarray. So it's not a great outcome from Colombia.
Yeah, disarray. Yikes. I feel like must try harder is just a long-running theme with these conferences again and again. But, with my optimistic hat on, what about this next COP? Is there any chance that could bring some brighter news for the planet?
I feel like I'm the resident doom correspondent here. So this next COP is actually the big COP that our listeners probably will have heard about. It's the annual meeting about climate change. So these climate COPs are much bigger. They're the ones where world leaders and business execs and celebs jet in to join country negotiators, campaigners and journalists to figure out the global response to climate change. And this COP that's about to start next week in Azerbaijan is COP29 because it's the 29th climate COP to have been held. And as I said, this year it's being held in Baku, which is the capital of Azerbaijan, which on the face of it might seem a bit of a strange choice for a climate meeting. Azerbaijan is a petrostate and fossil fuels make up more than 90% of their exports. And their climate targets are not bursting with ambition. But the way these meetings work is that each year a different region is nominated to host it, and countries within that region will bid to be the host state. So the region this year was Eastern Europe. Russia was blocking pretty much any EU country from being the host, so it went to Azerbaijan, the bid. So that's why everyone's off to Baku this year.
Off to Baku it is. What's actually on the agenda this time round?
Well, if we were speaking in a perfect world, this COP would just be a case of getting all the countries in the world together in a room and giving them all a big round of applause for how well everyone is doing cutting emissions. But
Yep, sounds likely.
I think you can pretty much guess that that's not going to happen, because we're not cutting emissions anywhere fast enough. The latest UN report, which came out a couple of weeks ago, put the world on course for between 2.6 and 3.1 degrees of warming by the end of the century, which is well above the 1.5 to 2 degrees goal that was set out in the Paris Agreement. But there's still hope that we can close this, what the UN calls the emissions gap, that gap between what we are targeting and the emissions that we're on course for. And COP29 is supposed to be the enabling COP to get that ambition rolling. So countries promised a few years ago to set a new climate finance goal, which is basically a promise of funding from rich countries to help developing countries cut their emissions and pay for adapting to climate change. And the principal goal of this COP, of COP29, is to hammer out the details of this new climate finance fund so that in time for the next COP, poorer countries will think, okay, we've got some more money on the table, we can afford to be more ambitious with our emissions cuts. So it's all about getting the framework in place that will enable countries to be more ambitious next year.
So it sounds good, sounds really important, but this has been quite a long-standing contentious issue, hasn't it? And something tells me the rich countries aren't feeling that rich right now, and there's not going to be, easily found money for the other countries to have.
I'll pay next week.
Yeah, I think it seemed quite easy when they agreed to this new fund quite a few years ago that at some point in the future they would hash out the details, but now that some point in the future has arrived, and obviously, there's lots of countries that aren't feeling hugely flush right now, given the geopolitical situation. So I don't expect this to be an easy negotiation at all, particularly as the scale of ambition for financing has really leapt in the last few years. Poorer countries are lobbying for a headline target of $1 trillion to start next year. Now, it's important to say that that won't all be from the coffers of rich nations. So you will get the likes of development banks, private investment, maybe levies on polluting companies could contribute to that. But you should expect that there will be calls for richer countries to devote a fair portion of their international aid to this. And that could amount to billions of dollars.
And so obviously people are going to be asking questions about the US. We now know that Donald Trump will be returning to the White House. How is that likely to affect things?
Yeah, it's going to complicate things. So it's important to remember that President-elect Trump won't take power until January the 20th. But his election will probably be quite a dark cloud over this summit. The US is sending quite a large delegation to the talks, and they are Biden administration delegates who may engage constructively and work to agree a finance goal. But in the background, everyone is going to know that Trump is about to take power, and he has said that he wants to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement for a second time. So there will be quite a lot of uncertainty surrounding the summit about whether whatever is agreed in Baku will hold past January the 20th. And that sense of uncertainty and instability is the exact opposite of what we want, which is to help countries build mutual trust so that they all move to cut emissions further together.
Yeah, I feel like with all of these COP negotiations, it's kind of like that old quote about democracy where COPs are really the worst process for making global climate action happen, apart from all of the rest. The negotiations always seem to go beyond the deadline, and they just become increasingly frustrating, and you get into the minutiae of it all. But we've got to keep trying, right? There's no other option.
Yeah, I think anyone who's attended these summits will say that it can be quite a frustrating experience, because you just hear about these arguments that go on for days about how a certain target is phrased or the exact wording that's used, and it can feel really divorced from the reality of what we're seeing in the real world and the impacts of climate change. But there's a couple of things to bear in mind. One is that for some countries, they're existence depends on what's agreed at meetings like this. So they can't really afford to give ground. And the other is that all decisions have to be made unanimously. So every country in that room has to agree to something before it can be passed. It is true to say, though, that COP29 is a particularly high stakes COP. As I said, we're not on track to meet the Paris goals. And one expert told me that this would be completely disastrous if they can't agree a goal on financing, because by next year, by February 2025, countries are due to submit new climate plans to the UN, which will say how far they want to cut emissions up to 2035. And without a signal that you've got more money coming, the fear is that we just won't see any more ambition from countries to cut emissions. And the thing to remember is that without more ambition from countries, we can say goodbye to keeping warming below 1.5 degrees.
Next up, we've got a story about Pando, the world's largest tree, a quaking aspen in Utah. As well as being the largest tree, we also think it's one of the oldest organisms on the planet, but narrowing down its age hasn't been easy. Rowan Hooper spoke to James Woodford to find out more.
We're going to go back to the Ice Age now. It's a time where most of North America was covered by glaciers. Mammoths plodded around what's now Manhattan. Now, what if I told you that something that's still living today was alive during that last great ice age? Today we're going to hear from our Australia reporter James Woodford. He's going to take us to one of the largest organisms on Earth, nicknamed Pando. We've talked about it on the podcast before. It's this single tree. It's a single shaking aspen tree, and it sprawls. So this single tree covers 43 hectares in Utah in Fish Lake National Forest. It's long been known that it's one of the largest organisms on Earth, but scientists have now confirmed that it's also, at least on the short list, for one of the oldest. Hi, James. How are you doing?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rowan. And I've got to say, compared to Pando, I feel like a spring chicken.
Me too. So go on, tell us about the new research.
Okay, so if you look online, you'll see all kinds of estimates for how old Pando is, ranging from 80,000 to even 1 million years. But until now, no one's been able to give a date for its age that's been grounded in science. A team led by Rosanne Pineau at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, they headed off to the forest and collected a bunch of bark, leaves, and root samples. And once they were back in the lab, they set about extracting genetic data, looking in particular for what's called somatic mutations. Now, these are changes in DNA that occur in an organism's cell after conception.
Right, so that's changes that occur in the body of an organism rather than in the sex cells, in the germline.
Correct. So, yeah, as I said, these are changes that have happened after conception. So basically, as Pineau explained to me, when Pando first germinated from a seed, all of the stems that emerged from the underground root mass would have been genetically identical. But over time, the tree has accumulated these somatic mutations. And by studying the rate that these mutations occurred, the researchers have been able to come up with a solid estimate for a minimum and a maximum age range.
Go on then. What did they find?
So they say that based on the rate of these mutations, the tree is a minimum of 16,000 years old and possibly up to 80,000.
Wow.
Yeah, it really is. It is wow. I mean, when you think of something to be 80,000 years old, that just blows your mind. But their mid-range date is 34,000 years. However, this is based on the assumption that they correctly identified every mutation in the part of the genome they sequenced. So obviously the 16,000 figure is a more conservative number. And as Pineau said to me, and this is a quote from her, that even at its youngest estimated age, this aspen clone has been growing since the last ice age. So, as you said at the beginning of this, you can imagine mammoths kind of being around this stand, and, that is an extraordinary thing to think about.
Yeah. And they've managed to sort of corroborate it with different kind of evidence, haven't they? Another sort of strand of evidence.
Yeah. Interestingly, there is some extra evidence, and that comes from pollen samples in a nearby lake that show that aspens have been growing continuously in this area for at least 15,000 years and have been really well represented for the last 60,000 years.
James, I don't know if you'd be able to answer this, but something I always wonder about Pando is it the same organism as it was 16,000 or 34,000 years ago? So what I mean is, the trees in the stand, the individual stalks of the trees, they don't look that old, do they?
No.
I wonder if it's, has it been constantly replaced by new cells? So it's more like the idea of Pando that is old, but the tissue of the organism isn't that old. What's going on?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So over the millennia, there's been tens of thousands of trunks that have come up out of the root mass under the ground. And those particular trunks, they only live for a century or so. So the really old part of the tree is actually underground. And you're correct. It would be very, very difficult to find a piece of timber, the roots of Pando that are 80,000 years old. It may well be that, something has been preserved in just the right conditions in the soil in some part of the organism. But no, this is a constantly growing organism that is regenerating. And actually, Pando, the word, it actually is Latin for spread. So that's what this organism has done. It started off as a single seed and it's ended up into this 43 hectare giant. But whether you would actually find an 80,000 year old root or piece of wood from the tree, that's a completely different question.
Okay. But do we have an answer, given that, on whether Pando is the oldest organism on Earth? Well, let's say the oldest eukaryote, the oldest complex organism, because, perhaps there's going to be bacteria somewhere that are, have been in a dormant state for maybe a million years or something. But do we have an answer on whether it's the oldest organism?
Look, there's a few other contenders that are definitely out there. The ones that come to mind straight off the top of my head are, and which we talked about in the story, one from Tasmania, which is Lamartia tasmanica, and it's estimated to be at least 43,000 years and maybe over 100,000 years.
Is that clonal as well?
That is clonal as well. And there's a patch of seagrass in the Mediterranean that the New Scientist actually reported on about 12 years ago. And according to the researchers who did that work, that patch of seagrass may actually be as old as 200,000 years.
Amazing stuff.
One of the more unusual videos on our website this week showed vampire bats running on treadmills as part of an experiment studying their very unusual metabolism. Matt Sparks is here to explain what's going on. Matt, bats running? Is that a thing?
Yeah, well, it was news to me as well, although our very own Graham Norton wrote a great feature last year about a similar thing, asking why there's no flightless bats, which also mentioned this bombshell that vampire bats can run. They can run pretty fast too. They're sort of evolved to stalk prey on land, and they can run at around 30 meters a minute.
Okay, that's not too bad. A 3 minute 100 meters is not exactly Usain Bolt, but for a bat, I guess that's pretty impressive. And I must say that video is amazing. The way a bat runs, it's got this very unusual gait. It's kind of a bit human walking on crutches. It's a bit strange mini demon dog. Like, I could watch it for days. It's amazing. But I'm presuming the purpose of this research was not an amusing video. Why have bats been put on a treadmill? What's the purpose of it all?
Well, two researchers at the University of Toronto wanted to look at the metabolism of vampire bats because they obviously have this very unusual diet of fresh blood. Most mammals, like us, we get the bulk of the energy for our movement from fats and stored sugars, but blood is pretty low in fats and sugars and very high in protein. So they imagined that something different was probably going on there. So they took these bats, they fed them on cow blood containing amino acids with labelled carbon atoms, And then they put them on this treadmill in a small box. And by examining the oxygen they consumed, the carbon dioxide they emitted, and analysing the carbon isotopes in that exhaled breath, the researchers found that they were drawing energy from this recent meal of blood rather than stored fats or sugars, which is pretty unusual, really.
So yeah, this idea of getting most of your energy from protein rather than fats and sugar is pretty rare, but we do know of a few animals that do it, like really hungry emperor penguins or hibernating bears. But that's when they haven't eaten for a really long time. And what we're talking about here is the vampire bats taking like all of their energy potentially from an immediate protein meal. Does that come with sort of any downsides? It's quite unusual.
Yes, definitely. Not being able to store away energy for later use, it makes them very susceptible to starvation, really. So they're in trouble after only 24 or 48 hours without a meal. But what they have done is they've developed a social strategy, a social solution to this, whereby they will help each other out by regurgitating blood for those that fail to find a victim to feed on, which I think is actually quite heartwarming, really.
I mean, that is delightful.
Delightful in theory, I guess, to watch, probably less so. So the bat's ability to run was quite key here, I suppose, because measuring these same inputs and outputs from a flying bat would be much more difficult, surely.
Yeah, exactly. There have been experiments like that on flying animals, but they tend to require big wind tunnels and probably quite a lot of patience too as well, I imagine. So the bats made it quite easy on the researchers here.
That's it for this week. Thanks to all our guests and thanks to you for listening. Do tell your friends about us or rate and review us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen.
You can also find more on our website, newscientist.com. We're not yet available in proto-cuneiform, but maybe soon. We'll be back next week as usual. It's bye for now.
Bye.
Do you want to just lead us in though, which I think is quite heartwarming?
Oh, yeah. Heartwarming.
Sorry, I was not prepared for that. At least give us a countdown.
3, 2, 1. Heartwarming.
This podcast is produced by OG Podcasts. Find out more at ogpodcasts.co.uk.